Ancient Rome is always associated with greatness and power, but behind its marble columns and triumphal arches, there were hidden secret signs, curses, and mystical predictions. Emperors sought advice from oracles. Priests performed rituals in underground sanctuaries, and the people believed in spirits that could change the fate of the empire. These mysteries still cause anxiety and curiosity. So today we will analyze 30 mysteries of ancient Rome that remain unanswered. The Curse of Carthage, the legend that Rome fell because of oaths sworn by the priests of Carthage. The history of the confrontation between Rome and Carthage has always been perceived as a clash of two civilizations equally thirsty for domination in the Mediterranean. The three Punic Wars have become a symbol of a merciless struggle where there was no room for mercy. But along with the chronicles of military campaigns and strategic victories, legends have been preserved in which the fall of Rome was explained not only by political crises and barbarian invasions, but also by an ancient curse pronounced by Carthaginian priests in the last days of the city. In 146 BC, the Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, stormed Carthage, reducing it to exhaustion after a 3-year siege. When the city's walls collapsed, the inhabitants experienced horrors that the ancient world had almost never seen equal. For 17 days, Roman soldiers destroyed houses, temples, and sanctuaries, turning everything into ashes. It is known that in the temple of the god Baal and the goddess Tanit, the priests and priestesses performed the last rite, sacrificing themselves and uttering words of curse on those who destroyed their city. According to legend, they called upon the powers of the underworld and the sea gods, so that retribution would befall Rome centuries later, and so that even the greatest emperors would not be able to escape the predicted punishment. The Romans burned the houses and fields of Carthage, covering the land with salt so that it would never yield a harvest. This act of symbolic destruction was perceived as the final erasure of the city from the face of the earth. But in the minds of people, it was fixed differently. The salt scattered over the ruins became a sign not only of emptiness, but also of a magical seal under which an ominous force was hidden. It was said that the spirit of Carthage rose into the sky with the flames, and with the smoke of the sacrificial fires the curse left, which in the future was to return to the heart of Rome itself. Legends of the curse were passed down from generation to generation, and they were especially active in the later times of the empire when its power began to wane. Christians and pagans alike found in them an explanation for their misfortunes. Some saw in the fall of Rome retribution for cruelty to Carthage. Others claimed that the spirits of the vanquished were stronger than human will. Even the famous historian Augustine Aurelius, who lived in North Africa, mentioned popular rumors linking the decline of the empire with the prayers of Carthaginian priests. A special place in the legends was occupied by the figure of the high priest Baal, who, as it was believed, before his death, swore an oath that the descendants of the Romans would suffer the same horrors that his people experienced. His voice, mixed with the roar of the flames, allegedly broke through time. In later centuries, it was said that during the barbarian invasions, when the Germans and Goths captured Rome, echoes of this voice could be heard in the air above the destroyed temples. The mystique was heightened by coincidences. In the 4th and 5th centuries, it was the North African Vandal tribes that dealt Rome one of its fatal blows, ravaging its lands and seizing its riches. This was seen as a symbolic return of Carthage. The land once cursed by salt seemed to come alive in the hands of new barbarians, and Africa itself sent vengeance to the heart of the empire. Not only the fall of Rome was associated with this curse, but also the tragedies of individual emperors. Nero, obsessed with the idea of greatness and the element of fire, seemed to repeat the fate of the Carthaginian temples when flames engulfed the capital. Commodus, who surrounded himself with mystics and Eastern cults, fell at the hands of conspirators, as if embodying the idea that no power is capable of suppressing ancient curses. Skeptics explain these legends as superstitions and a search for convenient explanations for the crises that befell the empire. But for the people of antiquity, belief in a curse was part of everyday life. They saw in the series of disasters not an accident, but a pattern drawn by the priests of the lost city. Even today, when archaeologists examine the ruins of Carthage, they find traces of sacrificial fires and inscriptions that are difficult to interpret. Some of them mention the gods of the underworld and appeal to forces capable of punishing enemies. These fragments of inscriptions reinforce the sense that the myth of the curse had real ritual roots. Thus, the history of the confrontation between Rome and Carthage turned out to be not only a political and military episode, but also a symbol of the eternal memory of death and retribution. For the ancient consciousness, the idea that even the greatest power could fall because of words spoken in the smoke of a destroyed temple was natural. And it was this idea that made the legend of the Curse of Carthage one of the darkest and most disturbing pages in the mystical history of ancient Rome, the ghost of Nero, supposedly wandering the ruins of the Golden Palace. Nero's name has been surrounded by legends and fears since the first centuries after his death. He was remembered as a mad emperor, an arsonist of Rome and a tormentor of Christians, and also as a man whose life ended in despair and humiliation. But for the inhabitants of the capital, the story did not end with his death. It was believed that Nero's spirit never found peace and still wanders among the ruins of the Golden Palace, recalling the crimes and curses of his reign. The Golden Palace, or Domus Aurea, was built after the fire of 1864, when vast areas of the city were reduced to ashes. On the site of the burnt-out quarters, Nero ordered the construction of a residence of unprecedented scope: marble, gilding, frescoes with fantastic creatures, artificial lakes and groves turned the palace into a whole world, torn from reality. This structure symbolized not the greatness, but the mania of the emperor, and it was this that later became the place where his spirit was bound. After Nero's suicide in 68, his body was buried on the slope of the Esquiline Hill, but rumors of his return began to spread almost immediately. People claimed to have seen him at night among the columns of the palace, a figure in white robes with a strange glow around his face. It was said that this was punishment for his life of murder and betrayal, and that the emperor's soul was forced to wander where he had erected the symbol of his pride. The image of Neron Redivivus, Nero returning to life, became ingrained in the Roman people. Over the years, there were impostors posing as the emperor, and the belief in his possible return was so strong that it was perceived as reality. For the people of Rome, Nero's ghost became a sign that evil does not disappear without a trace, and that destructive passions return, no matter how deeply they are buried. Gardens were later discovered in the ruins of the Golden Palace. Excavations were conducted, and each time they were associated with disturbing stories. Footsteps and sounds of music were believed to be heard inside the underground halls, as if Nero was once again enjoying a feast with long-dead guests. Some chronicles mentioned that slaves and warriors avoided spending the night near the palace, afraid of stumbling upon its ghost. For Christians, Nero's ghost became a symbol of eternal retribution. He was called the personification of the Antichrist, a harbinger of the end of time. The Apocrypha said that his spirit would wander until the Last Judgment, and that is why many associated night visions in the ruins with prophecies of the coming catastrophe. Even centuries later, when the palace was covered with earth and new buildings were erected in its place, the legends did not disappear. Artists of the Renaissance, descending into the underground grottos, told of a strange silence and cold that seemed to emanate from the walls. This strengthened the belief that the Golden Palace contains not only the magnificence of ancient art, but also the seal of a curse left by its creator. Thus, the image of Nero's ghost became part of not only the mystical history of Rome, but also the collective fear of the society that survived his rule. His spirit was perceived as a warning that tyranny and cruelty never go away without a trace. And while the ruins of the Golden Palace preserve the memory of its creator, legends about his wandering ghost continue to disturb the imagination, turning history into a living mysticism, where the boundaries between past and present are blurred. The mystery of the Roman aqueducts, rumors of secret underground passages and sunken sanctuaries. The aqueducts of ancient Rome have always amazed the imagination with their scale and engineering genius. These gigantic structures stretched for tens of kilometers, rising above the ground in arches and going deep into the thickness of the hills to supply the capital and provinces with water. However, along with the admiration of the Romans and their descendants, the aqueducts gave rise to fears and legends. After all, under the massive stone vaults, among the damp echoes and eternal darkness, were hidden not only water channels, but also secret stories about sanctuaries that disappeared into the dungeons, and passages leading to places where even soldiers did not dare to enter. Already in antiquity, there were rumors that aqueducts were built not only for water. Some claimed that part of the underground galleries connected with temples and secret halls intended for the rites of mystical cults. The chronicles mention that the priests of Mithra and the followers of the Eastern gods performed their rituals in the depths of the vaults, where the damp walls were covered with soot from the torches, and the silence increased the effect of mystery. In such places, sacrifices and oaths were supposedly made, which only the chosen ones knew about. Particularly mysterious stories are associated with the Claudian Aqueduct, one of the most impressive structures. According to legend, in its underground part there was a passage leading to a sunken sanctuary, where the guardians of the water worshipped the goddess who lived in the springs. It was said that the entrance was sealed by the engineers themselves after a series of accidents. Workers disappeared without a trace, and the water in the canals suddenly darkened and became undrinkable. The people of Rome believed that the aqueducts could become a portal to the world of underground spirits. At night, the guards heard strange sounds, like the hum of prayers, the noise of footsteps, or the splash of water where there should not be any. This is where the tradition of leaving small gifts at the entrances to the aqueducts arose: bread, fruit, or coins, to appease the invisible guardians. In later times, when the empire began to weaken, new legends were added to them. The barbarians who captured Rome said that they found halls with altars and images of creatures unknown to their people carved into the walls inside the aqueducts. For them, this was proof that the Romans had a special connection with dark forces that had made a pact of power with them. Archaeologists who studied the aqueducts in modern times did indeed find strange niches, walls with incomprehensible inscriptions and symbols. Some of them did not correspond to Latin writing, and were more reminiscent of signs of Eastern cults. Places resembling small sanctuaries were also discovered, where secret rituals could take place. But an explanation for their purpose has never been fully found. In the people's memory, aqueducts remained not only engineering marvels, but also gateways to an unknown world. Legends about sunken sanctuaries continue to live on today, arousing the interest of researchers and lovers of mysticism. And although the official history explains everything with practical tasks, the feeling that in the depths of these stone tunnels there are hidden secret passages to other worlds remains strong. After all, in the silence of ancient dungeons you can hear echoes of the past, in which reality and mysticism intertwine like water and stone, leaving no clear boundary between them. Oracles in the Temple of Apollo in the Cumaean Grottos. Among the ancient mystical places of Italy, a special place was occupied by the Cumaean Grottos, located near Naples. There, in the depths of the dark rocks, was the Temple of Apollo and the famous sanctuary of the Cumaean Sibyl, a priestess who was considered the conductor of the will of the gods and whose prophecies could change the fate of entire nations. For the Romans, this place was surrounded by an aura of fear and awe, because emperors and ordinary people came here, hoping to hear words about the future, and no one left it without the feeling that they had come into contact with something beyond. According to legends, the grottos were a complex labyrinth of corridors that went deep into the rock. Their walls were covered with symbols and traces of ancient torches, and the air inside was always cold and heavy, as if one had to breathe not only earthly air, but also the breath of other worlds. It was believed that the Sibyl lived right here, in the stone halls, where reality dissolved into the twilight, and the words spoken by her lips did not belong to human logic. The prophecies of the Cumaean Sibyl were often mysterious and dark. She spoke in allegories that could be interpreted in many ways. Thus, her famous prediction about the fate of Troy and the future greatness of Rome became part of Virgil's Aeneid, where Aeneas's meeting with the Sibyl in the grottos is described as a transition from the world of the living to the kingdom of shadows. For the ancient Romans, this episode was not just a literary image, but a reflection of real ideas that the Cumaean grottos were the gateway to the underworld. Priests, warriors, and even politicians flocked here to seek advice from the gods. Emperors, including Augustus, sent envoys to receive prophecies about wars and power. The Sibyl was believed to draw her visions from the breath of the earth itself. There were cracks in the grottos from which vapors rose, and these vapors put her into a trance, allowing her to utter words that were perceived as the voice of Apollo. Mysticism was reinforced by a special attitude towards the Sibylline books, a collection of prophecies allegedly collected by priestesses. According to legend, the Cumaean Sibyl herself offered the books with predictions to King Tarquinius, but when he refused because of the high price, she burned some of them. Only after this did the king agree to buy the remaining ones, and they were kept in Rome, playing the role of the most important reference point for the state. The destruction of these books was later perceived as a loss not only of historical heritage, but also of the protection of the empire. Skeptics claimed that the Sibyl's prophecies were cleverly crafted allegories in which everyone could find their own interpretation. But for the people of Rome, the words of the Cumaean grottos carried the weight of fate. If the Sibyl spoke of coming disasters, people believed that no armies or laws could stop them. If she predicted victory, it strengthened their confidence even in the most difficult times. Today, archaeologists are still exploring the ruins of Culm, finding traces of underground halls and corridors that retain the echo of ancient rituals. But even with a rational look, the feeling of mysticism does not disappear. In the cold stone walls, in the winding passages, and the echoing whisper of the wind, many feel the breath of history, in which legends and reality are intertwined. And so, the legend of the Cumaean oracles remains one of the most disturbing secrets of Rome, a reminder that faith and prophecy can be stronger than the sword and the army, and that a word spoken in the darkness of a grotto can change the fate of an empire. Prophetic dreams of Julius Caesar before his assassination. The story of Julius Caesar's death is known to everyone, but in the shadow of the act of murder itself, which took place on the Ides of March in the year 44 BC, there remains one of the most disturbing pages, the omens and prophetic dreams that preceded his last hours. These stories, collected by ancient authors, have become overgrown with mysticism over the centuries and have turned the murder of the great commander not only into a political conspiracy, but also into the fulfillment of a prophecy that could not be avoided. Ancient chroniclers claimed that, a few days before the fateful Senate session, Caesar began to complain to his loved ones that he was tormented by difficult dreams. In one of them, he saw himself hovering over the city, like a spirit torn from his body, and Rome bowing before him not as a living ruler, but as a dead symbol. In another dream, he saw his own house filled with blood, and the statue of Pompey, an enemy he had once crushed, coming to life in ominous silence. These images left a trace of anxiety in his soul, but Caesar's habit of not showing fear made him dismiss them as mere delusions. Of particular importance was Calpurnia, his wife, who, according to Plutarch and Suetonius, saw the roof of their house collapse the night before the tragedy, and Caesar lying stabbed to death in her arms. She begged her husband not to go to the Senate, and even asked the servants to keep him at home under the pretext of illness. But Caesar, accustomed to defying fate, only grinned, although he admitted to his friends that a strange premonition did not leave him. It is interesting that the Romans themselves treated dreams not as personal experiences, but as signs from the gods. For them, visions and dreams could be news of the future, and even a way of communicating with higher powers. And so, the dreams of Caesar and his wife were perceived as warnings that he ignored. Even more ominous was the scene described later by historians. Shortly before leaving the house, a soothsayer named Sparinus, who had already warned him about the Ides of March, came to him. When Caesar half-jokingly asked if that day had come, the soothsayer replied that the day had come, but was not yet over. These words only reinforced the aura of fatality, as if a chain of prophecies and dreams were inexorably leading to a tragic outcome. Visions and premonitions did not stop Caesar. He entered the Senate, where he was surrounded by conspirators, and at that moment, all the images of the night came true. Blood really did cover his body and clothes, and the statue of Pompey was desecrated by his death. It was at its foot that he fell under the blows of daggers. In the eyes of contemporaries, this looked not just like murder, but the fulfillment of a prophetic picture, predetermined in advance. These dreams and omens still haunt the imagination of historians and mystics. They show that even the greatest of men, having reached the pinnacle of power, remained vulnerable to the terrors of the night and to those secret signs that the ancients considered the voice of the gods. The question remains open. Were these coincidences a game of the subconscious, or was fate itself trying to stop Caesar by sending him visions that he did not want to hear? And so, the story of Julius Caesar's prophetic dreams lives on as a reminder that even the most powerful empires and the greatest men are powerless before the mystery of destiny, and that dreams can tell more than daytime prophecies. Prophecy of the end of Rome, attributed to the Sibyl. Among the many legends that shroud the history of ancient Rome, a special place is occupied by the dark prophecy of its end, attributed to the Sibyl, a mysterious priestess whose words were considered for centuries to be the voice of the gods themselves. Her predictions, contained in the famous Sibylline books, played the role of a kind of compass for the Romans, which they turned to in moments of great trials. But along with instructions on how to avoid disasters, there was another, much more disturbing legend that the Sibyl herself predicted not only the greatness of Rome, but also its inevitable fall. According to ancient sources, the prophecy was a chain of images and symbols. It mentioned rivers of blood flowing down marble streets and walls crumbling to dust under the weight of barbarian assaults. The Sibyl spoke of a time when the descendants of the she-wolf who suckled Romulus and Remus would forget the covenants of their ancestors, and then the land itself would turn away from the city. The fields would become barren, and the waters of the Tiber would turn into a stream of stench and disease. Some commentators claimed that the Sibyl's words even mentioned specific signs of the end. Among them were fires engulfing the temples and an eclipse hiding the sun on the day the enemy would break into the capital. According to legend, she also pointed to the internal cause of the destruction. It would not be the barbarians who would destroy Rome, but the greed, pride, and betrayal of its citizens, who would lose faith in the gods and replace it with a thirst for power and gold. Over the centuries, each new disaster was perceived as the fulfillment of these words. When the city was engulfed in fires, when enemies approached its walls, when the plague emptied the streets, the people remembered the Sibyl and her prophecy. Even the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century was associated by many chroniclers with the prophetic vision of the priestess, believing that the fulfillment of the ancient oath overtook the state that had ignored the signs for too long. What was particularly alarming was that the Sibylline books were destroyed. At first they tried to protect them as the greatest treasure, but fire and barbarian raids led to their disappearance forever. For the Romans, this symbolized that the gods themselves had turned their backs on their city and no longer wished to guide its destiny. In the absence of these texts, the legends of the prophecy of the end gained even more power, because now no one could verify where truth ended and fiction began. Even today, this prophecy is seen as a reflection of an eternal truth. No empire lasts forever, and its fall is not only the strength of external enemies, but also the weakness of the inner spirit. For posterity, the Sibyl became a symbol of the inevitability of fate, which, like a shadow, always accompanies greatness. And so, the prophecy of the end of Rome continues to sound as a warning that any power, no matter how strong its walls and laws may seem, collapses when the people forget their roots and allow pride to replace faith. This is the mysticism of the words of the Sibyl, which have survived millennia and still trouble those who seek answers in ancient secrets. The death of Emperor Trajan, legends of poison and betrayal. Emperor Trajan went down in history as one of the greatest rulers of Rome. His reign was marked by the expansion of borders to the maximum, the prosperity of cities, and the glory of an invincible commander. But the end of his life was shrouded in mystery and rumors that cast a shadow on the image of the great conqueror. What should have been a dignified departure of the emperor after brilliant victories turned into a dark story, full of suspicions of betrayal, poison, and secret intrigues. Official chronicles state that Trajan died in the village of Selinunte in Cilicia while returning to Rome after the Eastern campaign. His health was said to have been undermined by age and the strain of battle, but soon rumors began to circulate that the emperor's death was not natural. The Romans whispered that someone had helped bring it about. It had happened too timely, opening the way to power for his successor Hadrian. Particular suspicion fell on Plotina, Trajan's wife, who was at his side during his final hours. Sources say that it was she who announced the emperor's death and allegedly forged his will in order to transfer power to Hadrian. Legends claim that Plotina could have played a much more active role. Some spoke of a cup of wine laced with poison, others of a secret medicine that turned into a deadly drink. The court physicians were no less suspicious. In the Roman tradition, medicine and poison often coexisted, and the art of doctors could be used not only for healing, but also for elimination. Trajan was considered to have trusted his entourage, but it was precisely this trust that became his weakness. Intrigues were woven around the throne, and the death of the aging emperor opened new horizons for those who thirsted for power. The mysticism was further enhanced by the fact that Trajan's body was brought to Rome in a sealed vessel with ashes, and no one, except his close associates, saw his last moments. The people could not verify what exactly had happened in Cilicia, and rumors grew. Some claimed that the emperor cursed the traitors before his death, others that his spirit appeared in a vision to the soldiers, promising retribution. Historians of later centuries tried to find the truth. Some leaned toward the version of natural illness, while others believed that there were too many coincidences surrounding the ruler's death to believe in an accident. But regardless of the facts, legends of poison and betrayal took deep root, turning Trajan's death into a mystical symbol of the end of an era. Today, the emperor's death is seen as a lesson that even the greatest generals and rulers cannot protect themselves from the invisible blows, from the intrigues, poisons, and betrayals that lurk close to the throne. And herein lies the true drama of Rome. Not only were its enemies from without threatening its greatness, but its own shadows were undermining it from within. The mystery of the Basilica of Jupiter Dolicinus and the vanished cult. Among the many cults that flourished in ancient Rome, the cult of Jupiter Dolicinus occupied a special place. Its origin was associated with the eastern lands, the city of Dolicinus in Syria, from where it was transferred to the empire and quickly won the hearts of legionnaires and ordinary citizens. Unlike the usual image of Jupiter, the ruler of thunder and the sky, Jupiter Dolicinus was depicted in a warlike guise, in a short eastern chiton, with an axe in one hand and lightning in the other, standing on the back of a bull. This image inspired fear, and at the same time gave hope that the deity was able to protect his followers in battles and grant victory. The cult spread throughout the empire, especially among the soldiers. Altars and sanctuaries of Jupiter Dolicinus were found in camps on the Rhine and Danube, in Britain and Africa. His sanctuaries resembled small basilicas, surrounded by secrecy, since the rituals were performed only for the initiated. One of these centers was the Basilica of Jupiter Dolicinus, about which only fragmentary information has been preserved. It was believed that special mysteries were held there, during which the priests called not only thunder and lightning, but also the powers of the earth, combining the cult of Jupiter with the Eastern traditions of worshipping fertility deities. However, at the height of its popularity, the cult disappeared almost without a trace. Its altars were destroyed, its statues were smashed, and records of rituals disappeared from the chronicles. Archaeologists still find traces of cult buildings, but there is no clear explanation for why such a revered god was rejected. Some believe that the cult's decline is connected to the spread of Christianity, which saw it as a dangerous competitor. Others believe that its demise occurred even earlier, due to the sudden destruction of the main sanctuary in the east, after which the believers decided that God had abandoned them. There are many legends surrounding the Basilica of Jupiter Dolicinus. It was rumored that not only statues and altars were kept inside, but also ritual scrolls with secret knowledge brought from Syria. It was said that the priests could summon thunderstorms and control the winds, and the sanctuary housed a sacred axe, a symbol of power bestowed by the god himself. When the cult disappeared, these relics disappeared with it. Darker legends also survive. They claim that the worshippers of Jupiter Dolicinus made secret sacrifices not only of animals, but also of people, and that it was these bloody rites that became the cause of persecution. Christian chroniclers wrote that during the fall of the empire, they saw strange lightning strikes on the ruins of the basilica, as if God himself was punishing the traitors who had rejected his cult. Today, archaeologists find only fragments of temples and statues, fragments of lightning bolts carved into stone slabs, and images of a warrior standing on a bull. But the mystery of the cult's disappearance remains unsolved. Why did the god worshipped by legions across the empire disappear so suddenly? Was it the result of political decisions, religious reforms, or the prophecies themselves which the priests hid from the people? The basilicas of Jupiter Dolicinus still holds this mystery today. For historians, it remains a reminder of how quickly powerful beliefs can be erased, and for lovers of mysticism, a symbol of forgotten power, hidden in the ruins and shadows of the past, waiting for its moment to reassert itself. The myth of Romulus, who disappeared during a thunderstorm and became a god. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, was surrounded by an aura of mystery from the very beginning. His story began with a miraculous rescue on the banks of the Tiber, where he and his brother Remus were nursed by a she-wolf, and ended no less mysteriously, with his disappearance during a thunderstorm, which many perceived not as death, but as a transformation into a deity. This myth, preserved in the works of Livy, Plutarch, and other ancient authors, became not only part of the Roman religious tradition, but also a symbol of the mystical origin of the empire itself. According to legend, after the founding of the city and long years of rule, Romulus conducted state affairs with his usual determination and severity. He strengthened the army, approved laws, expanded the power of Rome, laying the foundations of the future state. But envy grew along with this. The senators, whom he had humiliated more than once with his harshness, whispered that Romulus's rule was becoming a tyranny. Tensions were rising in the city, and, as often happened in the history of Rome, political jealousies were intertwined with mystical signs of fate. The event that became the culmination of his life took place on the day of the assembly on the Campus Martius. Romulus was supposed to address the people and senators, but the sky suddenly darkened and a violent thunderstorm broke out over the city. The thunder roared so loudly that people could barely hear each other, and lightning cut through the air, illuminating the crowd. At that moment, according to eyewitnesses, Romulus seemed to dissolve in a whirlwind of storm. No one saw him again. When the storm died down, only stunned senators and people remained on the field, wondering what had happened. There are several versions of this mystery. The first, the most sublime, claimed that Romulus was raised to heaven by the gods. For the Romans, this was a confirmation of his divine origin. The founder of the city, the child of a she-wolf, and the chosen one of fate, could not die as a simple man. His disappearance during a thunderstorm was interpreted as a sign that Jupiter had accepted him into the ranks of the gods, and he became the patron of Rome under the name of Quirinus. A temple was erected in his honor, and the cult of Quirinal reinforced the idea that the city had not only a human, but also a heavenly foundation. However, there was another version, much darker. It was spread by disgruntled senators, and it was that Romulus had not ascended at all, but had been killed. Allegedly, it was during a thunderstorm that the conspirators attacked him, tore his body into pieces, and carried out the remains secretly to hide the traces of the crime. The storm and chaos of the crowd helped them conceal the murder. In this legend, Romulus's disappearance was perceived not as a divine miracle, but as the result of human envy and betrayal. To silence rumors of a conspiracy, the senators soon announced to the people that Romulus had not died, but had become a god. They claimed that he had been seen ascending into the sky amidst lightning, and that he had appeared to certain of his confidants, promising to protect Rome if the people would keep his laws and honor his memory. This story became a tradition, and gradually the dark version of the massacre was supplanted by the official myth of the divine ascension. However, even centuries later, the Romans had mixed feelings about this story. On the one hand, they revered Romulus Quirinal, offering prayers to him and seeing him as the city's heavenly protector. On the other hand, there was always the doubt that behind the myth there was ordinary human cruelty, and that the disappearance of the founder was not a gift from the gods, but the work of men. This contradiction made the story even more mystical, because it was precisely in it that the paradox of Rome lay, a city founded on blood, but elevated to legend as a child of fate. For the Romans, the thunderstorm during which Romulus disappeared had a special significance. In their view, lightning was a direct manifestation of Jupiter's will. The fact that the disappearance occurred at such a moment could not be perceived as an accident. Many believed that nature itself participated in Romulus's ascension, hiding him from the eyes of the crowd and performing a miracle that became a symbol of Rome's eternity. Archaeologists and historians still argue about the real basis of this myth. Perhaps the senators really did kill Romulus, but realizing that the people would not accept such a truth, they turned his death into a legend about divine ascension. Perhaps the people themselves, shocked by the sudden death of their ruler, gave this event a sacred meaning. But whatever actually happened, the legend of Romulus preserved his status not just as a king, but as a being standing between people and gods. The greatness of this myth is that it created a special model for Rome. Every emperor, every general understood that his power and glory would be measured not only in life, but also in how the people perceived his death. The story of Romulus set an example that death could become a mystical transition, an act of becoming a divine figure. Thus, the disappearance of Romulus during a thunderstorm became a symbol of Rome's inseparable connection with the heavens. It was a story about how the city built by man stands under the protection of the gods, and its founder forever remained between the worlds to watch over the fate of his creation. For the Romans, this was not just a legend, but proof that Rome was destined to be eternal because its founder himself became eternal. And today, this myth continues to capture the imagination. It reminds us that the origins of great empires are almost always shrouded in mysticism, and that the boundary between history and myth can disappear, as Romulus did in a storm, leaving behind only the legend of a man who became a god. the figure of the witch Canidia in the poetry of Horace and the real stories of Roman witches. In the poetry of Horace, a special place is occupied by the sinister image of the witch Canidia, whose name became a symbol of dark magic and witchcraft in ancient Rome. In his Satires and Epods, the poet describes her as an old woman with a withered face, tangled hair, and a look full of madness. Surrounded by her fearsome assistants, Canidia brewed potions from herbs, roots, and blood, used the bones of dead babies, and summoned night demons to sate her thirst for revenge and passion. She is seen as the embodiment of fear of secret feminine powers that transcended the familiar world of Roman gods and laws. Horace portrayed her in a terrifying but also mocking manner, as if Canidia's witchcraft were not only a real threat, but also a subject for satirical condemnation. However, behind the literary image there was a reality. Rome did know stories about witches, who inspired no less horror in the people than the mythical heroines. Women accused of witchcraft were a regular occurrence in Roman history. They were suspected of brewing love potions, poisoning enemies, causing illness, and even death. One of the most famous cases was the so-called Affair of the Poisoners in the 3rd century BC, when dozens of women were accused of making poisons and put on trial. For the Romans, the connection between magic and poisoning was obvious. Potions and spells were considered part of the same art, the ability to covertly influence the fate of people. Horace's Canidia reflected this fear in many ways. In his poems, she gathered poisonous herbs from cemeteries, summoned the shades of the dead, stole bones and hair to imbue her spells with the power of death. These details were not the poet's invention, but a reference to real practices that the Romans knew and feared. It was believed that witches collected plants at night at crossroads, on the borders of the world of the living and the dead, and that their rituals were accompanied by chants addressed to chthonic deities, Hecate, Proserpine, Manes. Roman society perceived magic in two ways. On the one hand, official priests and oracles were recognized as bearers of sacred knowledge, and their rituals were considered legitimate. On the other hand, secret female magic, hidden from the gaze of the state and men, caused disgust and panic. Canidia personified this frightening world. She symbolized a woman who broke free from the traditional framework of family and morality, turning into a keeper of forbidden knowledge and destructive forces. Historical chronicles also mention sorcerers and sorceresses, who were banished from the city for necromancy or forbidden practices. But despite the punishments, magic lived on in everyday life. Love spells, amulets, spells against illness or enemies, all of this remained part of Roman culture. People went to sorceresses secretly, even if they were publicly condemned. Thus, the image of Canidia became collective for the Romans. She was both a satirical character of Horace and a reflection of the real fear of women who possessed secret knowledge. This fear consisted not only of the possibility of poisoning or illness, but also of the very idea that someone could interfere with fate and change it contrary to the will of the gods and the law. Horace's poetry preserved Canidia as a symbol of sinister female witchcraft, but in her shadow, we can discern the real stories of Roman sorceresses, whose secret rituals excited the imagination of their contemporaries. And in this combination of literature and reality, Roman mysticism appears especially vividly. Fear of invisible forces that could not be subdued by either power or reason. The mystery of the Roman keys to the underground catacombs. The underground catacombs of Rome have always been a source of mysticism and anxiety. These endless corridors, going deep underground, served not only as a burial place, but also as a secret refuge for the first Christians, a refuge in times of persecution, and a space where rituals were carried out in absolute darkness, lit only by torches. But among all the legends associated with the catacombs, the mystery of the so-called Roman keys stands out in particular. Metal objects found by archaeologists in different parts of the underground passages, the origin and purpose of which still remains unclear. These keys, shaped like something between simple locking devices and symbolic signs, did not always fit the doors or locks known in the catacombs. Many of them were decorated with strange symbols, not resembling the usual ornaments of Rome. Some were carved with animal figures, snakes, owls, crows, that were associated with the underworld and magic in Roman culture. Others were marked with signs resembling Greek letters, but arranged in a chaotic manner, making them look more like a cipher than an inscription. Historians suggest several versions. According to one of them, the keys were associated with early Christian communities. It was believed that the owner of such a key could open not only the physical doors of the catacombs, but also gain access to closed ritual rooms where the sacraments of baptism or community meetings were held. Perhaps the keys served as a symbol of trust. If a person brought it, he was given access to the most hidden part of the dungeons. There are also darker hypotheses. Some researchers believe that the keys could have belonged to secret cults that practiced magical rituals underground. This version is supported by symbols reminiscent of necromancy signs. According to legend, rituals to summon spirits were sometimes performed in the catacombs using the bones of the dead, and the key served as a kind of seal that allowed entry into the world of the dead. In this interpretation, keys were not so much tools as amulets that connected the living with the other world. Archaeologists also note a strange pattern. Keys are most often found in places where catacombs lead into narrow and poorly explored tunnels leading deeper, where there are no traces of regular use. This gave rise to the legend that the underground passages of Rome had a second, unknown network leading to sunken sanctuaries or abandoned pagan temples that were not mentioned in official sources. In this context, the keys become a symbol of the path to a forbidden space that only the chosen could enter. Folklore that survived into the medieval tradition claimed that the Roman keys could open the doors of time. According to these stories, if a person found the right passage in the catacombs and used the key on a certain night, he could find himself in another time or meet the souls of deceased emperors and martyrs. Such stories were considered legends, but the very fact that they existed showed how powerful an impression these mysterious finds had on the imagination. There are also practical explanations. Perhaps the keys were connected with the protection of the catacombs. Some of them did have doors and bars to restrict access to certain niches. But it remains a mystery why such keys were made so complex and decorated with strange symbols, clearly excessive for a simple lock. Today, Roman keys are kept in museums, and each of them raises more questions than answers. They look like ordinary objects, but their symbolism makes you wonder what exactly was hidden in the dungeons of Rome. Were they just a sign of belonging to a secret society, a tool for locks, or an amulet that allowed you to go further? We will never know. The mystery of the Roman keys to the catacombs remains a reminder that beneath the layers of historical facts, there is always room for mystery. Perhaps it was just a utilitarian object, or perhaps it was a piece of knowledge that never reached us. And while archaeologists explore new levels of the underground passages, the legends about the keys live on, like shadows of the past, holding secrets that Rome chose to hide in its eternal darkness. The curse of the Colosseum and the strange deaths of the emperors associated with it. The Colosseum, Rome's greatest amphitheater, was originally intended to symbolize the empire's strength and eternity. But behind its grandiose appearance lurks a disturbing shadow. Many rulers who were somehow connected to the structure died strange and painful deaths. In the popular imagination, this gave rise to the legend of a curse that has accompanied the Colosseum since its foundation. Construction began under Vespasian, a stern and decisive man who dreamed of leaving his descendants a monumental symbol of Rome. But it was at the end of his life that the first rumors of bad signs appeared. Chroniclers wrote about night fires and cracks in the foundation. Vespasian died unexpectedly, according to legend, from a stomach ailment, and the Romans whispered that this was retribution for the fact that he built a theater on the site previously dedicated to Nero's house, in a garden that was considered cursed. His son Titus, who opened the Colosseum with grand games, also died soon after under strange circumstances. Contemporaries spoke of a fleeting fever, but rumors circulated among the people that his death was caused not by illness, but by an ominous force that accompanied the new walls of the arena. It was Titus who was credited with the phrase that he felt that his life was leaving with the breath of the Colosseum. Titus's brother Domitianus, who continued to decorate the amphitheater, died in an even more horrific manner. He was murdered by his own confidants in his chambers, and his death was perceived as a continuation of a series of misfortunes. People believed that the entire Flavian dynasty, which built the Colosseum, was marked with the seal of a curse. But the legends did not stop with the Flavians. Centuries later, when the arena remained the center of life, emperors who staged particularly bloody spectacles there died painfully. Commodus, who loved to appear as a gladiator, was strangled in a bathhouse, and many saw this as an echo of punishment for the fact that he had humiliated Rome by turning its sacred arena into a private place of entertainment. Caracalla, who also held bloody games, was killed on the road, stabbed by his own bodyguard. Even later rulers who tried to use the Colosseum to restore its former glory ended tragically. Some were poisoned, others were betrayed by their closest allies. A myth spread among the people that the spirits of the dead gladiators and animals filled the Colosseum with a curse. Thousands of deaths, the blood soaked into the sand of the arena, created an invisible aura. It was believed that anyone who tried to use the amphitheater for a show of power, sooner or later, faced death. Medieval chronicles reinforced these stories. Christian writers claimed that the Colosseum stood on the blood of martyrs, and that their souls had cursed the place. They wrote that the walls of the arena had absorbed the cries of the dying, and now every ruler associated with it became a victim of inevitable retribution. Archaeologists and historians today see in these stories rather a symbolic meaning. The Colosseum was not just a building, but a place where cruelty, spectacles of death, and power politics were concentrated. It is not surprising that the fates of the emperors, closely connected with the arena, were tinged with mystical veil. But for the ancient Romans, these coincidences were not accidental, but proof that the Colosseum lived its own life and avenged the blood spilled within its walls. The curse of the Colosseum continued to reverberate for centuries. Even when the amphitheater ceased to be a place of battles, its ruins remained a symbol of the empire's demise. People believed that as long as the Colosseum stood, Rome would live, but if it fell, so would the world. This thought conveys not only mystical anxiety, but also the belief that greatness always brings a curse. Thus, the curse of the Colosseum became one of the most terrible legends of ancient Rome, a story about how monuments of power can turn into monuments of death, and the arena of glory can become a trap for those who dared to place their fate next to its bloody walls. Mysterious Mithraic cults in the underground Mithraeums of Rome. The cult of Mithra, which came to Rome from the east, was one of the most mysterious and secretive religious traditions of late antiquity. Its secret rites were performed in Mithraeums, underground sanctuaries skillfully carved into the ground or built in dark basements. These sanctuaries were cramped and low, reminiscent of caves where devotees could have a mystical experience, as if they were returning to the mythical grotto in which the god Mithra performed his greatest feat, the killing of the bull from whose body life on earth arose. Archaeologists find mysterious images in Mithraeums. Mithra in a Persian cap pierces a sacred bull from whose wounds cereals and grapes burst forth, next to which a scorpion stings the bull in the genitals, and a dog and a snake drink his blood. The symbolism of this scene remains not entirely clear. Some scholars see in it an allegory of fertility and the eternal cycle of nature, others, an astronomical map, where each animal is associated with constellations, but not a single ancient author left a detailed description of the mysteries of Mithra. Everything we know is based on fragments, symbols, and guesses. The rituals in the Mithraeums were only available to initiated men, most often soldiers and officials. Initiation took place in stages, and each of them was called by a special name: raven, hidden, soldier, lion, Persian, heliodrome, father. It is believed that with each stage the participant received new knowledge and special duties. However, the secret of the rituals was strictly guarded, and the initiates never divulged details. It was this silence that made the cult so frightening to outsiders. People believed that in the depths of the Mithraeums, rituals were performed in which sacrifices and blood played a key role. Legends about the Mithraists spread throughout Rome. They were said to meet at night, drink the blood of sacrificial bulls, form fraternal alliances sealed with secret oaths, and worship the light that came out of the darkness. For the common people, all this sounded like a challenge to the traditional gods. And for the early Christians, the cult of Mithra became a dangerous rival. After all, there was a sacrament of the sacred meal in which bread and wine symbolized the divine gift. The underground Mithraeums were designed to symbolize the cosmos. A narrow passage led into a long room with stone benches along the walls where the faithful gathered. In the center stood an altar with an image of Mithras, and in the back was a niche with his relief, illuminated by torches and lamps. The atmosphere was full of mysticism. The smell of sacrificial meat, the smoke of oil, and the subdued light created a sense of the presence of the supernatural. What exactly happened during the mysteries remains a mystery. Perhaps the new converts were tested. They were doused with cold water, forced to walk through darkness, or even watch the execution of an animal. Perhaps astral meditations were conducted when the neophyte learned the secret paths of souls after death. But no hypothesis has been definitively confirmed. With the disappearance of pagan cults, Mithraism also died out. Christianity gradually replaced it, although, in some aspects, both teachings overlapped. But the memory of the Mithraeans remained, and in the ruins of Rome, underground halls with images of Mithra and his bull are still found. These places make a frightening impression even on modern researchers. Narrow spaces, low vaults, symbols whose secret is still hidden. The cult of Mithras has become one of the greatest mysteries of ancient Rome. We know its symbols, we see its underground temples, but we do not understand the essence of the rituals. And it is precisely this mystery that makes it so attractive, as if in the depths of the Mithraeans there is still hidden knowledge that was given only to the chosen ones and was never revealed to the world. The mysticism of the Forum of Boaria, sacrificial altars with mysterious inscriptions. The Forum Borii, the oldest cattle market in Rome, was not only a place of trade, but also a space where pagan traditions intersected with mysticism and superstition. Here, at the foot of the Palatine and Aventine Hill, the Romans erected altars dedicated to a variety of deities: Hercules, Fortuna, unknown local spirits. But archaeologists and historians point out a special phenomenon. On some sacrificial altars, inscriptions and symbols have been discovered that cannot be clearly deciphered, which gave rise to legends that the Forum Boarii was a place of secret cults and forgotten gods. The surviving stone blocks, dating from the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC, contain short Latin inscriptions written in an unusual way. Some words are made up of distorted letters, while others break off in the middle, as if the rest of the text was known only to the initiated. The researchers were particularly drawn to the formulas that resembled spells. They repeat names, mixed with unclear symbols that resemble magical sigils. On one of the altars, the word semita is found, a path, a way, but next to it there is a sign resembling an intertwining of snakes, which in the Roman tradition indicated a transition between worlds. Legends say that these altars were not erected by ordinary priests, but by the servants of mysterious cults who used the Forum Boarii as a crossroads for their rituals. Not only animals were sacrificed here, but also, perhaps, symbolic offerings, figurines, amulets, vessels with blood. According to legend, such rituals opened the way to underground forces that could give wealth, luck in trade, or protection from diseases. Some researchers believe that the mysterious inscriptions are related to Greek or Etruscan influence. After all, Rome absorbed the culture of its neighbors in its early period, and the altars could reflect traces of forgotten languages or secret cult traditions. But the mystery lies in the fact that such inscriptions are found only on the Forum Boaria and almost nowhere else in the city, which makes it a unique space of mysticism. The Romans believed that the Forum Boarii stood on the site where Hercules had defeated a monstrous bull, or, according to another version, the fire-breathing Cacus. Altars with mysterious signs were associated with this myth, believing that the passage to the world of heroes and spirits was preserved here. It was said that at night one could see reflections of blue flames above the altars, a sign that the sacrifices were accepted not by people, but by the forces of another world. Medieval chroniclers, seeing half-ruined altars, claimed that these were stone books left by ancient magicians. In their view, these symbols opened the gates to knowledge about the stars and the destinies of people. Even in the Renaissance, the Forum Boarii was considered a place where ancient forces resided. Alchemists and mystics searched for stones and fragments with inscriptions there, believing that they contained formulas of power. Today, the mystery of the sacrificial altars remains unsolved. Scientists continue to argue whether these symbols are just fragments of formulas that have lost their meaning, or whether they really did hold a secret accessible only to the chosen few. But the very fact that it was in the Forum Boaria, a place of trade and cattle, that so many unusual signs were concentrated, suggests that the Romans perceived it not just as a market, but as a sacred crossroads where the world of people came into contact with the world of gods and spirits. The mysticism of the Forum Boaria remains part of that dark side of Rome, where secret rituals and fears lived alongside the grandeur of the empire. Altars with inscriptions whose meaning we can no longer understand remind us that the ancient Romans knew how to leave messages not only for their descendants, but also for the powers they revered and feared at the same time. Ghost stories from the Roman baths. Roman baths were not only places of relaxation, purification, and socialization, but also spaces where, according to contemporaries, strange and disturbing phenomena occurred. Their complex architecture, filled with steam, echoes, and the dim light of torches, created an atmosphere where the boundary between the world of the living and the dead seemed shaky. This is why the history of Rome contains numerous stories about ghosts, supposedly inhabiting the baths, turning these symbols of civilization into hotbeds of mysticism and fear. The most famous legends were about the baths of Caracalla. This huge complex, which could accommodate thousands of people, was considered a magnificence of architecture and engineering. But it was there, according to legend, that people saw figures in white togol appearing among clouds of steam. Some claimed that these were the souls of slaves who died during construction. Others said that these were the spirits of the victims of the Emperor Caracalla, whose cruelty became the talk of the town. They even wrote that Caracalla himself appeared in his baths after his death. His shadow wandered the corridors, sometimes appearing in the mosaic halls, reflected in the water, as if in a mirror. No less gloomy stories were related to the baths of Trajan. There they told of a woman who drowned in the pool of the Frigidarium. Her silhouette, according to eyewitnesses, rose from the water at night, when the baths were already empty. People believed that her death was not accidental. Allegedly, she was sacrificed by a group of secret priests who used the water of the baths as a place of rituals. Even private baths located in wealthy homes had their own scary stories. One popular tale was of a ghostly apparition in the baths of a wealthy senator, where servants heard footsteps and screams at night, although the rooms were empty. Later, it was said that it was the spirit of a gladiator killed by the owner of the house in a quarrel, and his body was hidden under the bath floor. Of particular importance was the Roman belief that steam and water themselves could act as conductors of spirits. When a person entered the thick fog of a steam room, it was as if he or she were crossing the boundary of worlds, and it is therefore not surprising that visions became part of the experience. The thick steam and the play of torchlight created images that many took for the presence of the dead. Later, Christian writers reinforced this image by calling baths dens of demons. They claimed that it was there that demons deceived people by taking the form of the dead, and that victims of luxury and debauchery remained attached to these places even after death. Archaeologists studying the ruins of the baths found strange evidence. Amulets, spells scratched on the walls, small figures hidden in cracks. All this confirms that the Romans themselves perceived the baths as a place where it was necessary to protect themselves from evil spirits. The legends of the ghosts of the Roman baths have survived to this day as a reminder that even in the heart of civilization, amidst marble and splendor, people saw shadows, feared the invisible, and felt the breath of death. The baths, a place of life and purification, easily became in their imagination the gateway to the world of the dead, where steam and water became a veil for those who never left Rome. Ominous signs are the eclipses and meteors that accompanied the fall of the empire. The ancient Romans lived in a world where celestial phenomena were not perceived as a simple play of nature. Every solar or lunar disk hidden in shadow, every fiery streak cutting through the night sky, were understood as messages from the gods. The more turbulent the times, the more often they looked for warnings and prophecies in these signs. The fall of the Roman Empire was accompanied by a series of celestial signs, which were written about by chroniclers, and each of them was considered a symbol of impending disaster. Solar eclipses had a special effect on the Romans. Imagine a city plunging into the darkness of day, people screaming, dogs barking, birds falling to the ground. Chronicles report that before the death of Julius Caesar, an eclipse was observed in Rome, and many said that it foreshadowed a bloody denouement in the Senate. Later, during the time of Emperor Augustus, the moon's shadow again covered the sun, and the people saw this as a sign that the greatness of the young state would not last forever. But celestial phenomena were especially often associated with the late era, when the empire was already bursting at the seams. In the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, chroniclers recorded a series of eclipses, each of which was perceived as a warning. When wars broke out on the borders and unrest began in the heart of Rome, people looked up and saw darkness in broad daylight. For them, this was not a coincidence, but the seal of fate. Of no less importance were meteors and fire stars. The Romans believed that the fall of celestial bodies meant the death of great people or the collapse of entire states. In 410, when Alaric's Visigoths approached the city's walls, a flaming trail was seen in the sky, like a spear piercing the darkness. This event was recorded as a sign of the fall of the Eternal City, and shortly before the final collapse of the Western Empire in 476, chroniclers wrote of rains of fire, as if the heavens themselves were bringing down a curse on the earth. Popular interpretations were full of horror. Some claimed that the gods had turned away from Rome and were sending darkness to show the end. Others saw it as retribution for the blood of Christians spilled in the arenas. Astrologers found confirmation of their predictions in eclipses and meteors. They calculated the fates of emperors and wrote that each new fiery sign in the sky foretells the death of the ruler. Later, Christian writers reinforced this image. For them, the signs in the sky were not a game of the gods, but a manifestation of the will of the one God, punishing proud Rome. They claimed that the darkness in the middle of the day and the falling stars were biblical symbols of the end times, and that the fall of the empire was only the beginning of much more terrible events. Today, scientists can explain these phenomena by natural causes. Eclipses can be calculated retroactively, and meteor showers are associated with the Earth passing through the tails of comets. But for the ancients, this knowledge was inaccessible. Every time the sky darkened or a flame flared above the horizon, they felt the touch of fate. That is why the fall of Rome, in the minds of the people of that time, was not just a historical process. It looked like the fulfillment of a prophecy that the heavens themselves had warned about in advance. Ominous eclipses and meteors turned into a symbol of the fact that even the greatest empire cannot resist the fate written in the stars. The mystery of Roman sarcophagi with images of other worlds. The sarcophagi of Rome, created for noble citizens and emperors, have long been the subject of study by archaeologists and art historians. Most of them are decorated with mythological scenes, the abduction of Persephone, the exploits of Hercules, the battles of heroes. But among the many such monuments, there are special sarcophagi, where the reliefs depict scenes that cannot be clearly associated with classical mythology. They show strange spaces, figures, and symbols, which many researchers call images of other worlds, mysterious afterlife realities hidden beyond human understanding. One of the most striking examples is a sarcophagus from Rome, which is carved with a scene of a staircase rising into the heavens, surrounded by stars and shining figures. A man in a cloak climbs the steps, and at the bottom, he is met by creatures with wings and strange headdresses. Scholars argue whether this depicts the soul's journey to the world of immortals or a secret ritual of initiates. The difficulty is that there are no direct analogies to such a composition in ancient mythology. Other sarcophagi show scenes where the world of the living seems to dissolve into another dimension. One of them shows city walls, behind which an ocean opens up with monsters that resemble not Greek centaurs or sirens, but fantastic creatures with wings and eyes on their bodies. Sometimes mysterious geometric signs are placed nearby. Circles, triangles, intertwining lines. All this is more reminiscent of an esoteric language than a familiar decorative tradition. There is a hypothesis that such images are connected with Eastern cults, especially Mithraism and Neoplatonism. These teachings paid great attention to the journey of the soul after death, and imagined different levels of the universe that must be passed through in order to reach the light. Perhaps the Roman masters tried to express such ideas in stone, creating scenes that were understandable only to the initiated. At the same time, ordinary Romans saw something disturbing in these reliefs. Chroniclers wrote that people were afraid to stop at night near some sarcophagi. It seemed that the figures came to life, and the stairs and gates on the stone turned into real passages. There were legends that the souls buried in such sarcophagi did not find peace and came out of them on special days of the year when the border of the worlds became thinner. Medieval monks who found these sarcophagi in the ruins called them demon stones. For them, the mysterious images were proof that pagans worshipped dark forces. But some Renaissance alchemists and mystics saw in these scenes codes left by ancient oracles. They claimed that the drawings on the sarcophagi contained secret knowledge about the structure of the universe and the passage of the soul through the stellar spheres. Today, archaeology confirms that some of these images do not have direct mythological parallels. Sarcophagi with stairs, gates, and cosmic symbols remain rare, but they are the ones that make the strongest impression on researchers. They seemed to conceal the Romans' fear of the unknown and, at the same time, their hope that death is not the end, but the beginning of a journey into worlds inaccessible to the living. The mystery of Roman sarcophagi with images of other worlds remains unsolved. We will never know whether they were an expression of secret cults, philosophical teachings, or personal visions of the masters. But each such sarcophagus reminds us that even in a civilization that prided itself on its rationalism and practicality, there was always a place for mysticism, where stone became a portal to the unknown. Mysterious cults of Saturn and his bloody holidays. The cult of Saturn was one of the most ancient and mysterious in Rome, inherited from the archaic traditions of the Latins and Etruscans. Saturn was considered the god of time, harvest, and abundance, but there was always a dark side in his image. Unlike Jupiter or Mars, who represented strength and power, Saturn was associated with the cycle of birth and death, with the inevitable destruction that comes after wealth. His temple on the Capitol was not only a place of worship, but also a kind of treasury for Rome, which gave the cult even more sacred significance. The most famous festival in honor of Saturn was Saturnalia, which began on December the 17th and lasted for several days. Outwardly, it was perceived as a joyful time of freedom and upheaval of the usual order. Slaves and masters changed places, people held feasts, gave each other candles and statues, filled the city with laughter and noise. But behind this external joy, there was a much darker basis, dating back to the most ancient times. Ancient authors wrote that the cult of Saturn was initially accompanied by human sacrifices. Pliny the Elder and Macrobius mentioned that in ancient times, people were sacrificed at his festivals to appease the god associated with the bloody cycles of time and fertility. Later, people were replaced by wax figures, sigillaria, but the memory of real victims lived in legends and inspired horror. Particularly alarming was the tradition of reversing social roles. A slave could sit at his master's table while his master served him, and although this only happened for a few days, in the eyes of the Romans, it looked like a dangerous game with the very fabric of the world order. People believed that during Saturnalia, the boundaries between worlds became fluid. The spirits of the dead could return, and Saturn himself, associated with the underworld, emerged from his prison to roam the city. Some chroniclers claimed that it was during these days that strange events occurred. People saw shadows in alleys, heard voices of the dead in houses, and found symbols scratched into the walls of the streets, as if signs from those who did not belong to the world of the living. Saturn was perceived as a god devouring his children, and the Romans believed that if he was not appeased, he could devour Rome itself. Christian writers later demonized the cult even further, claiming that Saturnalia was the devil's day of power, when people abandoned divine order and gave themselves over to chaos. They saw the tradition not as a celebration of the harvest, but as a bloody ritual commemorating a demon that the Romans had elevated to the rank of a deity. Today, historians continue to debate the real depth of these rites, but archaeological finds, in particular, altars with images of Saturn with a sickle and sacrificial symbols, confirm that this god was perceived not as a kind guardian of the harvest, but as a dark and terrible force demanding sacrifices. His cult was both a celebration of freedom and a ritual of remembrance of death, a reminder that behind every joy there is a shadow, and behind every harvest there is blood. The mysterious cults of Saturn and his bloody festivals remain one of the most sinister testimonies to how deep in the heart of Rome lived the belief in the cycles of destruction and rebirth. And even in the era of the empire's splendor, the Romans could not forget that above them always stood the god of time, to whom sooner or later they would have to pay their debt. The Lemurian Rite, how the Romans tried to expel evil spirits. Among the many ancient Roman holidays, a special place was occupied by Lemuria, a mystical rite dedicated to the expulsion of evil spirits of the dead. If Saturnalia was a time of revolution and joy, then Lemuria, celebrated in May, was filled with fear and anxiety. It was believed that it was on these days that the souls of the restless dead, called lemurs, returned to the world of the living to wander the streets, enter houses, and take revenge on those who had offended them during their lifetime, or did not show them due funeral honors. The main character of the ritual was the head of the family, who was responsible for protecting the house from the invasion of ghosts. At night, he walked around the house barefoot, performing ritual actions that were supposed to close the path to evil spirits. The most famous and strange element of the ritual was the use of beans. The owner would take 9 black beans and throw them over his shoulder, uttering a spell in which he promised that these beans would take the souls of the dead. The Romans believed that spirits would willingly follow the beans, perceiving them as a sacrifice, and leave the house. After this, the owner would strike a bronze vessel or pan, creating a booming sound that would scare away the most stubborn ghosts. Some sources mention that words of exorcism were spoken, something like the formula, "Away, spirits of ancestors, go away." The household members had to remain silent at this time, so as not to attract the attention of those who had not yet left. Interestingly, even the origin of the name of the ritual itself was associated with spirits. Lemurs and larvae were not just the souls of the dead, but dangerous, vengeful entities. Unlike the benevolent lares, patrons of the family, lemurs were considered sinister and restless. They could bring diseases, cause fires, or send bad dreams. Therefore, Lemuria was not a holiday, but a necessary means of survival, a kind of night battle with invisible enemies. Christian authors later condemned this ritual, calling it demonic. They claimed that the Romans were actually contacting the spirits of hell. However, the very fact that the ritual was preserved for centuries speaks of its deep roots in Roman culture. People believe that if you neglect the Lemuria, misfortunes will not take long to appear. Modern researchers see in this holiday ancient magical practices of purification, dating back to the Italic tribes. Black beans symbolized death and fertility at the same time. Noise personified the expulsion of chaos, and the night ritual was a way to restore order in the home and family. Today, the Lemurian rite remains one of the most mysterious pages of Roman religious life. It shows that even in an empire with majestic temples and philosophical schools, there was a world of everyday mysticism where ordinary people fought invisible fears with beans, bronze vessels, and whispered incantations. It was a reminder that Rome lived not only by laws and armies, but also by the fear of the dead, whose footsteps could resound in the silence of the night. The death of Pompey, legends of the priests who predicted the catastrophe. The tragedy of Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD was one of the most horrific catastrophes of antiquity. A sudden eruption of Vesuvius buried the cities under ash, leaving behind streets, houses, and bodies of residents frozen in time. But, along with archaeological finds, legends have come down to us, according to which the death of Pompeii was not unexpected. Priests and soothsayers allegedly warned of the impending end, but their words went unheeded. Ancient authors report that long before the catastrophe, local residents observed strange signs. The waters of the springs became bitter, animals left their pastures, and red reflections, similar to a glow, appeared above the summit of Vesuvius. In some temples, there is evidence that priests made unusual sacrifices to the gods of the underworld, trying to appease the forces awakening in the mountains. According to legend, they warned that the earth would open up and swallow up all living things, but most townspeople dismissed their words as mere dramatic images. The Temple of Venus, the patroness of the city, plays a special role in the legends. It was believed that the priestesses of Venus fell into a trance several months before the catastrophe and said that the white cloud will turn black, and the day will turn into night. These prophetic speeches were interpreted in different ways. Some saw them as a metaphor, others, a threat of war. But later, when a deadly column of ash and gas hung over the city, the words of these priestesses found frightening confirmation. Another legend tells of a priest of Apollo, who supposedly predicted the destruction of the city by observing the behavior of birds. He noticed that flocks had left their usual nests and disappeared towards the sea. In Rome, such phenomena were considered an unmistakable omen of trouble. But the inhabitants of Pompeii, accustomed to minor earthquakes, did not attach any importance to this. When the eruption began, the priests, according to some chroniclers, tried to conduct ceremonies of appeasement, but fire and smoke scattered their altars. People saw this as a sign that the gods had turned away, and the earth itself had risen up against the city. There is even a legend that one of the priests was found frozen at the entrance to the temple. He did not leave his place and died holding a vessel with sacrificial blood in his hands. Over time, these stories became intertwined with Christian interpretations. Christian authors claimed that the eruption was a punishment for the depravity and idleness of the Pompeians. For them, the priests and their prophecies only confirmed this. The heavens had warned of punishment, but the people did not heed it. Today, science explains the catastrophe as a natural result of geological processes. But legends about priests who saw signs of the gods' wrath in smoke and earth continue to live. They reflect the ancients' fear of the forces of nature, which seemed to them not just elements, but the will of higher powers. The destruction of Pompeii remains a reminder that even the greatest civilization is powerless against mountains and fire. And if the legends are to be believed, there were warnings, but people chose not to listen, and the city disappeared, leaving behind only silent stone streets and a history in which the prophecies came true, all too literally. The mystery of the disappearance of the Ninth Legion in Britain. The Ninth Legion was one of the most famous Roman military units. Its history stretched back to the time of Julius Caesar, and it fought in Spain, Gaul, and against the Germans. But the Legion is most remembered for its mysterious death in Britain. According to sources, around the beginning of the 2nd century, the Legion, which numbered thousands of experienced warriors, disappeared, leaving no trace behind except rumors and legends. The Legion is still mentioned in official documents from the last decades of the 1st century. Its soldiers were stationed as a garrison in the fortress of Eboracum, modern York. But by 120, references to the Ninth disappear from all Roman lists. Modern historians debate whether it was destroyed in battle, disbanded, or secretly transferred to another part of the empire. However, it is the version of total annihilation in Britain that has given rise to many dark stories. Legends say that the Ninth Legion was sent north to pacify the rebellious Pictish and Breton tribes. The soldiers moved deep into the misty lands where swamps and forests hid their enemies. According to one version, the Legion fell into a carefully prepared ambush. Thousands of soldiers were surrounded, and none returned to tell the tale of Roman discipline, meeting the fury of the local tribes. Other stories say that a fog descended on the force, and the soldiers simply vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed them up. In Britain, there are still place names and legends connected with this mystery. In villages, it was said that at full moon, you could hear the tramp of invisible soldiers marching in formation across the marshes. Children scared each other with stories about the Ninth Legion having gone to another world, and its ghosts still wandering the cold hills. For the Celtic tribes, the disappearance of the Romans was proof that their land was protected by the spirits of their ancestors and the gods of war. Archaeologists have tried to find traces of the battle, burials, weapons, or the remains of a camp, but no convincing evidence of the Legion's complete destruction has ever been found. This has added to the aura of mysticism. If thousands of soldiers died, why have no mass burial grounds been found? If the Legion was transferred to another region, why have its signs and inscriptions disappeared? Roman historians also left no clear answer. Tacitus and Dione Cassius mentioned the unrest in Britain, but were silent about the fate of the Ninth. Such silence looked suspicious, as if someone was deliberately hiding the catastrophe so as not to undermine faith in Rome's invincibility. In an empire where the honor of the Legion was a symbol of power, the disappearance of an entire unit could be perceived as a disgrace. Today, researchers are inclined to believe that the Legion was indeed defeated in Britain, although this version has not been definitively confirmed. But for the people of that time, surrounded by mysticism and belief in omens, the disappearance of the Ninth became a symbol of the wrath of the gods and the power of a wild island that was not conquered even by Rome. The mystery of the Ninth Legion lives on in legends, books, and films. It is a story of how even the most disciplined army can vanish into the mists of a foreign land, leaving behind only silence and whispers, the footsteps of warriors never seen again. The cursed legions that disappeared in the Scottish Highlands. Roman Britain always remained a difficult and rebellious outskirts for the empire, where the harsh climate, unruly tribes, and unfamiliar landscapes turned every campaign into a trial. Particularly frightening for the Romans were the lands north of the later-built Hadrian's Wall, the mountains and valleys of Scotland, inhabited by the Celts and Picts. It was there, according to legends and traditions, that entire units of Roman legions disappeared, and to this day, these stories are surrounded by darkness and mysticism. Chronicles mention that several detachments were sent deep into the mountainous regions to pacify the tribes. However, unlike the campaigns in Gaul or Germany, the Romans here encountered not only fierce resistance, but also mysterious disappearances. Warriors spoke of thick fogs that suddenly descended on the gorges and seemed to break the ranks. When the fog cleared, individual cohorts could disappear without a trace. No one found bodies, weapons, or camps, only silence and traces of fires that burned out without their owners. According to one legend, these lands belonged to the ancient gods of war, to whom local priests made bloody sacrifices. When the Romans dared to violate sacred burial mounds or destroy sanctuaries, their troops were cursed, and they stopped returning. Ancient Pictish tales claim that the spirits of the mountains themselves rose up against the foreigners. The earth shook underfoot, rivers overflowed their banks, and warriors were drawn into the darkness by an unknown force. There are stories of a campaign in which as many as 1,000 soldiers allegedly entered the ravine and were never seen again. The few survivors were said to return to camp, crazed and empty-eyed, claiming to have seen great shadows encircling the legion in the mountains. Their speeches sounded like delirium, and their fate is as mysterious as the disappearance of their comrades. Roman commanders tried to hide such stories, so as not to undermine the army's morale, but rumors spread faster than orders. There was a widespread belief among soldiers that the northern lands were cursed and that the gods of Britain were taking revenge on anyone who stepped too far. Many refused to believe that these were only military defeats. The disappearances were too strange to be explained by ambushes or rebellions. Archaeologists and historians have tried to confirm the legends, but excavations in Scotland have so far yielded no answers. Stone forts and Hadrian's Wall remind us of Rome's attempts to stop its advance north, and the silence of the chronicles only adds to the sense that something was being deliberately hidden. For the Romans, the vanished legions became a symbol of the futility of conquests in these lands. It was after such events that the empire abandoned plans for the complete conquest of the north and focused on strengthening the borders. And for the local tribes, this story turned into proof that even mighty Rome was powerless against the spirits of their mountains and the power of their ancestors. Today, the myth of the cursed legions lives on in British folklore. In the misty valleys, people still tell of hearing the footsteps of soldiers at night, the clatter of weapons, and the distant blast of a trumpet. These are the ghostly echoes of the Roman army that never returned, forever captive to the Scottish Highlands and the legends that grew up around their mysterious disappearance. A hoard of cursed coins, sacrificial offerings that brought misfortune to their owners. The ancient Romans regarded coins not only as a means of trade and wealth, but also as sacred symbols that could become a link between the world of the living and the world of the dead. In temples, wells, and sacred springs, archaeologists have found entire hoards of coins that were clearly not an accidental loss. These gifts to gods and spirits were meant to appease the higher powers, but over time, legends arose around such finds about cursed coins that brought misfortune to those who dared to take them. One such legend is connected with a mysterious treasure discovered in the ruins of a temple in Capua. It was believed that the coins were sacrificed to the underground gods during the years of a terrible epidemic. People threw silver and bronze into the sacred pit, praying for salvation. However, when centuries later, peasants found this treasure and decided to appropriate it for themselves, a series of misfortunes began in the village. Cattle suddenly began to die, houses burned in accidental fires, and the finders themselves died one after another, some from illness, some in strange accidents. Similar stories were told in other parts of the empire. In Britain, a legend tells of a Roman soldier who, while excavating a sanctuary, found a vessel containing coins. He secretly took the find away, but soon began to have nightmares. He saw dead people reaching out and demanding that he return what he had stolen. His death came quickly and mysteriously. He seemed to have suffocated in his sleep. His comrades then threw the coins back into the ground, thinking that they belonged to the gods. It is characteristic that the Romans themselves feared such curses. The texts contain references to the fact that sacrificial offerings should be left in place, since any touching of them defiles a person and brings wrath upon him. In magic tablets, curses are found, where the souls of the dead are called upon to guard the victims and punish thieves. Thus, belief in cursed treasures was part of everyday religious practice. Archaeology confirms that many treasures were indeed hidden, not for safety, but as part of a ritual. The coins were found in springs, wells, or buried under altars. Their location excluded the possibility of the owner's return, which makes them sacrifices rather than accumulations. Modern tales of cursed coins sometimes sound like a continuation of ancient legends. Tourists and collectors who find random Roman coins near old temples claim that they were haunted by illness, bad luck, or frightening dreams. Perhaps these are coincidences, but the atmosphere of the find and the ancient stories of cursed gifts make the imagination work. The mysticism of the cursed coin hoard reminds us that in Rome, money could be not only a source of power and prosperity, but also a dangerous connection with the other world. For ancient man, they were not just metal, but a symbol of a deal with the gods, the violation of which entailed retribution. And even after 2,000 years, the idea that such coins can keep someone else's fate makes us treat them with anxious respect. Strange sacrifices in the Temple of the Vestals and the disappearance of the sacred fire. The Temple of the Vestals, in the heart of Rome, was considered one of the city's main sanctuaries, because the sacred fire of the goddess Vesta, the guardian of the hearth and the very fate of the empire, burned there. 6 Vestal priestesses, dressed in white, watched to make sure the flame never went out. It was believed that while it burned, Rome will stand firm. The dying of the fire was interpreted as a sign of the wrath of the gods and a harbinger of disasters. But in addition to the official rites, surrounded by solemn holiness, there were legends among the people about strange sacrifices that were secretly performed in the temple and were accompanied by mystical disappearances. According to legend, sometimes gifts were brought to the Temple of the Vestals that did not fit into the traditional cult. Instead of the usual offerings of fruit, bread, or wine, animals were found whose bodies were charred, as if they had been thrown directly into the fire. Ancient authors hinted that such gifts could have been part of secret rites associated with the invocation of underground forces. Some claimed that voices and groans were heard in the temple at night, and the Vestals performed rites that were unknown to the people. A special place in these legends is occupied by the mysterious disappearance of the sacred fire. In rare cases, it did go out. And this was always accompanied by disasters, the invasion of enemies, epidemics, or the death of emperors. Historians explain this by chance or the negligence of the priestesses, but the people believed that secret rituals were the cause. According to one story, one Vestal allegedly sacrificed blood by pouring it into the hearth, after which the flame went out, and an epidemic fell upon the city. In Rome, such rumors were perceived as a terrible insult to the goddess. The Vestals were especially honored, but if they were suspected of breaking vows or secret rites, the punishment was cruel. There are known cases when they were buried alive in underground chambers, accused of desecrating the sacred fire. The people believed that such executions not only restored justice, but also returned the favor of the gods. Legends also say that the extinguished fire was not always rekindled by ordinary torches. Sometimes it was necessary to use special rituals, lenses that collected sunlight, or sacred objects hidden in the temple. This gave the disappearance of the flame an even greater mystical connotation. Archaeological research does not find direct evidence of secret sacrifices, but the very existence of fear of the fire dying out shows how deeply people believed in the mystical connection between the flame and the fate of the state. Every time it disappeared, the inhabitants of Rome saw it not as an accident, but as a sign of higher powers. Today, the Temple of the Vestals lies in ruins, but the image of the fading fire and strange nocturnal rites still haunts the imagination. For the Romans, it was a reminder that even the most sacred power could turn into a curse if abused. For us, it is one of those ancient mysteries where the line between religion and mysticism remains a blurred and disturbing vestige of the past. Oracles in the Temple of Apollo in the Cumaean Grottos. The Cumaean Grottos, located near Naples, were surrounded by an aura of mysticism and fear even in ancient times. According to legend, the Cumaean Sibyl lived there, in the dark corridors carved into the tuff, a priestess of Apollo whose prophecies were revered and frightening at the same time. It was believed that it was here that the deity of light and truth descended to earth to tell through the lips of a woman about the fates of cities, empires, and individuals. The grottos were long corridors with narrow windows, from which rare rays of sunlight penetrated, creating an ominous play of light and shadow. In these walls, according to ancient authors, the air was filled with a strange smell and heavy vapors. Believers believed that it was the breath of Apollo himself that plunged the priestess into a sacred trance. The Sibyl sat on a stone throne, her body began to tremble, her voice became low and hoarse, and then she uttered words that were recorded by assistants on tablets. The words of the Sibyl were rarely clear. They came in the form of riddles, images, and hints that required interpretation. But it was precisely this vagueness that gave the prophecies their special weight. They could be applied to many different events, and there were always those who saw in them a sign of fate. The oracles of the Cumaean Grottos predicted wars, the fall of kingdoms, and the death of emperors. One of the most famous legends was that the Sibyl predicted the arrival of Aeneas in Italy and the founding of the future Rome, making the grottos a sacred place for all of Roman history. However, the fame of the Cumaean Sibyl also had a dark side. People believed that those who dared to ask too bold questions could lose their minds or their lives. Legends told of warriors who entered the grotto to find out the outcome of a battle and return blind or mute. Others claimed that some visitors disappeared into the depths of the dungeons, as if they had been taken by the gods. One of the most disturbing legends was that the Sibyl kept books of prophecy written in her own hand. These scrolls, known as the Sibylline books, supposedly contained secrets to the future of Rome. When one of the kings refused to buy them at the price she demanded, the Sibyl burned some of the scrolls, claiming that the rest were still worth the same. Only then did he agree, but he was forever left with the feeling that part of his destiny had been lost with the fire. Today, archaeologists find evidence of the existence of mysterious galleries and halls where rituals could actually take place, but they are unable to explain the phenomenon of prophecies. Perhaps trance states were caused by poisonous fumes from the earth, and ambiguous predictions were just a skillful trick of the priestess. But for the Romans, this was a place where the gods spoke directly, and the darkness of the dungeons kept the answers to the most terrible questions. The Cumaean grottos remain a symbol of how closely faith and fear were intertwined in the ancient world. Oracles here sounded not as a consolation, but as a test. To hear the truth meant to touch a secret that could change fate, but never promised peace. Curses written on lead tablets. In the shadow of the great temples and forums of ancient Rome, there was another, darker layer of faith. The belief in curses written on lead tablets called defictiones. These thin sheets of lead, covered with carved letters, did not contain prayers to the gods, but secret spells full of malice, pain, and a thirst for revenge. They were buried in the ground, lowered into wells, placed in graves, or hidden in walls so that the words would gain power and reach the powers they addressed. The tablets contained a wide variety of curses. Some asked for a love rival to be punished so that he would lose his beauty or become sterile. Others appealed to the gods of the underworld, wishing to paralyze the tongue of a witness in court or to make the speech of a political opponent unsuccessful. There were also those who demanded the death of an enemy, the words wrapped around the victim's name like chains and bound him to the world of the dead. The curses found in Roman baths, amphitheaters, or circuses were considered especially terrifying. There, people left tablets to curse a rival charioteer, a gladiator, or a crowd favorite. The texts preserved words full of poison. May his eyes be blinded. May his bones be broken. May he lose his strength. These lines testify that even entertainment in Rome was permeated with hidden magic, and success depended not only on skill, but also on secret rituals. Sometimes the lead tablets were pierced with nails or bent, as if tying the fate of the victim into a knot. They were left in tombs in the belief that the spirits of the dead would pass the words on to the underworld. Archaeologists have found hundreds of such tablets, each carrying a piece of the Romans' fear and hatred. But there were other, even more mysterious texts. Some tablets were written in mirror writing, or strange symbols that resembled a mixture of Latin and Greek characters. This was considered a magical code that enhanced the power of the spell. There were also images of demons, snakes, or gods of the underworld accompanying the text, like cursed seals. For the Romans, this was not something marginal or rare. On the contrary, such practices were part of everyday life. Even educated people, senators, or merchants, did not hesitate to resort to magic when it came to fate, wealth, or love. Behind the glitter of civilization, there was a belief that fate could be bound by letters inscribed on cold lead. Today, the tablets that were found read like whispers from the past, the voices of people who lived in fear and thirsted for revenge. Some lines sound almost mundane, others like curses worthy of an ancient tragedy. But they all remind us that Rome was built not only on laws and swords, but also on faith in mystical forces that could decide the outcome of a person's life. The lead tablets remain a symbol of the dark side of Roman faith, the side where words were turned into weapons and hatred took on material form to haunt the enemy even after death. The prophecies of the Sibylline books and their disappearance in late antiquity. Among the greatest mysteries of ancient Rome, a special place is occupied by the Sibylline books, collections of prophecies attributed to priestesses who allegedly heard the voice of the gods themselves. According to legend, They came to Rome during the time of King Tarquinius the Proud. An old woman known as the Cumaean Sibyl appeared to him and offered 9 scrolls with predictions about the fate of the city. When the king refused because of the high price, she burned 3 and offered the rest again for the same amount. Tarquin refused again, and then 3 more scrolls disappeared. Only after the 3rd visit did he agree, but he bought only a third of the original collection. This myth alone gave the books an aura of dangerous power. Part of their destiny was irretrievably lost in the fire. From then on, the Sibylline books were kept in the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill and guarded by the priestly college of the Quindecemvirs. They were opened only in exceptional cases, when Rome was on the brink of disaster. According to ancient authors, it was in them that people looked for answers when the city was shaken by earthquakes, epidemics, or terrible signs in the sky. It is known that after a series of eclipses, the books ordered new cults of gods to be brought to Rome, including Cybele and Apollo, to appease fate. Thus, the prophecies directly influenced politics and religion, changing the face of the empire. But the mysticism of the books was not only in their content, but also in their secrecy. The common people were forbidden to see them. The texts were read only by selected priests, and then retold to the authorities in fragmentary form. This gave rise to legends that lines were hidden inside that foreshadowed not only troubles, but the very end of Rome. There were rumors that the Sibyl predicted the fall of the empire and the advent of a new faith that would sweep away the old gods. The fate of the books was as mysterious as their appearance. In the 4th century BC, they burned down along with the Temple of Jupiter. It was said that the Senate sent messengers throughout Italy and Greece to collect prophecies similar in style and restore the collection. But whether they could be authentic remained a mystery. They were subsequently rewritten and moved several more times until they finally disappeared in late antiquity, already in the 4th to 5th centuries AD, when Christian emperors saw them as a threat to the new religion. Today, historians debate what exactly the Sibylline books contained. Some believe that they were political texts created by priests to strengthen their power. Others are sure that they contain genuine ancient prophecies, possibly based on Eastern mystical traditions. But the fact remains, the disappearance of the books has deprived us of the opportunity to understand what secrets they hid. The legend of the Sibylline books still haunts the imagination. Their story combines the pride of Rome, the fear of fate, and the sense of loss. It is as if at the very heart of the empire, there had always been a text that could tell the truth about its future, but that truth had dissolved in the darkness of time. And so, the disappearance of the books is perceived not as an accident, but as a sign. The prophecy came true in that the prophet disappeared, leaving only a shadow of his secret, the cult of the Lares and Manes, Roman spirits of the dead haunting the living. For the Romans, the world of the living and the world of the dead were never separated by a blank wall. They believed that the souls of ancestors and the dead not only lived nearby, but also actively influenced the fate of their descendants. In everyday life, every Roman felt the invisible presence of Lares and Manes, spirits that were worshipped but also feared, because it was believed that if neglected or insulted, they turned into evil forces that persecuted the living. Lares were revered as benevolent guardians of the hearth and family. Their images were placed in special niches, Laria, and decorated with wreaths, flowers, or figurines. On holidays, they were brought wine, bread, fruit, and sometimes the blood of sacrificial animals. It was believed that as long as the Lares were happy, the family would live in harmony and wealth. But if they were forgotten or desecrated, they could turn into vengeful spirits, bringing illness, discord, and poverty. The Manes were seen as more distant and mysterious shades of the dead. They were honored during special festivals such as the Parentalia, when Romans would visit graves, light fires, and leave food. This was thought to appease the spirits of the ancestors, allowing them to remain silent and undisturbed. But legends held that if the Manes were forgotten, they would rise from their graves and haunt homes, becoming tormented ghosts. The fear of angry spirits gave rise to many rituals. The Romans believed that souls could appear in dreams, leave cold touches, or even drop objects in the house. To protect themselves, people recited spells, sprinkled wine or milk in the house, and banged on copper objects to drive away ghosts. There was also a more sinister custom. On certain nights, the owner of the house would throw black beans over his shoulder, believing that the shadows would follow them and leave, having had their fill of the gift. At the same time, the cult of Lares and Mane was not only connected with fear, but also with memory. It was important for the Romans that the name of the deceased did not disappear, because oblivion was considered a second death. Therefore, home altars and public holidays were a means of maintaining contact with ancestors, so that their spirits did not become enemies. Historians and archaeologists find evidence of this cult everywhere. Small statues of lares in the ruins of houses, inscriptions on tombstones, references in literature. But there is a much deeper idea behind it. Rome lived in constant dialogue with the dead, and this connection was both sacred and disturbing. Legends of sinister phenomena associated with the Manes were preserved in later sources. Whole houses were said to be emptied because the residents heard footsteps and groans at night, and some saw figures in white shrouds. Such stories fueled the belief that not all spirits were pleased and not all agreed to offerings. The cult of Lares and Manes is one of the most terrifying layers of the Roman religious tradition. It shows how strongly ancient people felt the breath of death next to them, and how they tried to pacify it, turning the memory of ancestors into a ritual, and the fear of the dead into a rite of worship. For them, the world of the living and the world of shadows always remained intertwined, and every forgotten spirit could one day return to remind of its existence. Phantom chariots that were allegedly seen in Rome after the executions of gladiators. Majestic Rome was proud of its Colosseum and other arenas, where tens of thousands of spectators eagerly watched the deadly fights of gladiators. For the people, these were celebrations of strength and cruelty. But behind the glitter and noise of the games, the Romans sensed something dark, as if the very ground beneath the arenas was saturated with blood and began to give birth to its own visions. Later sources and folktales said that after the executions of gladiators, ghostly chariots began to appear in the city, fiery, fast, filled with the ringing of invisible hooves and the rumble of invisible wheels. Legends say they were seen at night on the roads leading from the amphitheaters to the city gates. The chariots raced so fast that the wind raised dust, and it seemed as if the horses were breaking through the stone walls out of the mist. Some stories say that gladiator-like figures sat on them, with wounded bodies and empty eye sockets. It was as if they were returning to finish their final fight, only now their arena was not made of stone, but of the very air of the city. The locals believed that these chariots were the embodiment of the souls of fallen warriors who had not found peace. Gladiators died violent deaths. Their bodies were often not buried according to the usual rituals, but thrown into pits or burned without prayers. In Roman beliefs, such dead became restless spirits whose rage could disturb the living. The noise of the ghostly chariots was perceived as a warning. The blood spilled in the arena does not disappear without a trace, but returns as an echo that is heard even by those who turned away during the final blow. Witnesses claimed that sometimes the chariots rushed right through the crowds of night passers-by, causing no physical harm, but leaving horror and cold in the chest. People said that after meeting this vision, a person could fall ill, lose his voice, or see nightmares with images of gladiators. In special cases, it was believed that the souls chose a victim, and then the person soon died under strange circumstances. Archaeologists exploring the underground rooms of the amphitheaters found bones in pits and traces of ancient rituals, which confirmed that the Romans themselves feared the wrath of the dead and tried to appease them with secret sacrifices. But the beliefs about ghostly chariots lived longer than the official rituals. Even when the amphitheaters began to collapse, residents for centuries told stories of nightlights and the rumble of wheels coming from the ruins. Today this can be explained by psychology or natural phenomena, the play of light, the echo of footsteps in stone arches, a disturbing imagination. But for the ancient Romans, everything was clear. The ghostly chariots were a sign that the arenas were filled with too much blood. Each gladiatorial festival left a mark in the spirit world, and this mark could not be erased by time or power. These legends show that even in a society accustomed to death as a spectacle, there was still room for fear and the recognition that life and death were inseparable. And if the gladiators' bodies died in the arena, their shadows continued to roam the night streets of Rome, reminding the living of the price of their spectacles. The mysterious death of Emperor Domitian and prophecies about his death. Emperor Domitian went down in history as a ruler whose reign combined grandeur and fear. He was feared by senators, hated by many of his confidants, but at the same time, the people saw him as a defender of discipline and order. However, behind the facade of power, his life was accompanied by disturbing omens, as if fate itself was preparing him for a terrible end. Ancient chroniclers claim that Domitian's death was predicted long before it happened, and he lived in constant anticipation of the blow. It was said that as a young man he heard a prophecy that he would die on a certain day at the hands of a loved one. From that moment on, he became obsessed with fear. He carefully chose his entourage, suspected even his most loyal servants, and installed mirrors of polished stone in his chambers so that he could see those standing behind him. His anxiety reached extremes. He checked knives in the kitchen, forbade bringing weapons into the palace, and surrounded himself with bodyguards. But it was this obsession, according to historians, that led to his end. The prophecies surrounding Domitian multiplied with each passing year. Chroniclers wrote of eclipses, which he considered bad signs, of dreams in which he saw his own palace being destroyed, and even of strange animals appearing in Rome before his death. According to legend, a few days before his death, he dreamed that the goddess Minerva, whom he worshipped, had turned away from him. For the Romans, this was not just a dream, but a direct sign that their patroness had abandoned her. When the fateful day arrived in September 96, the prediction came true with frightening accuracy. His closest men, the eunuch Parthenius, and his trusted officers, plotted. The emperor was taken by surprise in his own chambers and stabbed to death, despite all precautions. Legend has it that it was one of his most trusted confidants who struck the first blow. Thus the prophecy became reality, and the fear that had haunted him all his life became reality. After Domitian's death, Rome felt as if not only the prophecies about him had come true, but also the warnings about the fate of the entire empire. His death marked the end of the Flavian dynasty, and many took it as a sign that the divine will itself had turned against the line that ruled Rome. Today, historians debate how reliable the stories are about the prophecies that surrounded his life. They may have been invented after his death to give the tragedy an air of inevitability, but the fact remains, Domitian himself believed in the prophecies, and this belief guided his actions, increasing his cruelty and mistrust. The mystical story of his death became a symbol of the fact that no power and no precaution can protect one from fate. The emperor who held the fate of millions in his hands was powerless before his own predicted end, and this shadow of prophecy still makes his image one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of Rome. Even Rome's greatest rulers could not escape the fear of the destiny. His death was not just a political coup, but a symbol of the fact that prophecies and omens lived in the consciousness of the Romans more powerfully than the power of the emperors themselves. Remembering everything we have mentioned today, we can say with confidence that Rome left behind not only majestic arches, roads, and laws, but also shadows in which its secrets live. Oracles, curses, ghosts, and vanished cults remind us that the empire was not only the power of reason and sword, but also a world of mysticism, forever hidden beyond the edge of history. Ujus episode